Ni ni sa ni da ma ga ma ni da ma ga ri ga ni da ma ni sa ga ri sa ni da ma ni sa ni da ma ni sa வானம் பார்த்து கிடந்தேனே மழையாய் வந்து விழுந்தாயே வழி துணையே வழி துணையே. I haven't viewed music with a certain sense of rigidity. Mm-hmm. It's always been something that feels like an ocean that's flowing everywhere, and it's something I can tap into as and when I feel like. But the first musician that I fell in love with was Semmangudi Srinivasa. So the first song I ever sang was a Tiruppugazh. I didn't know it in the moment. It felt very special when I was singing it, and it felt very magnetic. Music was all the time. It was something that was like water, like air, like anything else. It was an element.
Hello and welcome to The Hindu. Today we are thrilled to have with us singer-musician Sid Sriram. Hello brother, how are you?
Good brother, good to see you.
Good. You know, you are a very popular singer these days. You've sung multiple film and, classical recordings and all that. But I was thinking, let me take you back to the first recording of yours, which I'm told happened when you were just 3. It might have been pretty, you might have been pretty young at that point of time to actually recall that particular experience. But based on the stories that you heard from your parents and from family, can you recall that for us?
Sure. Yeah, obviously I don't have my own vivid memories of it, but from stories, and also there's like a couple of videos that we have from that point. I guess I do somewhat recall the spirit of the emotion that I felt at that time. And I think the first thing that occurs to me now thinking back on it is it felt natural. Like it didn't, maybe even like for the first time being on stage and singing, I felt like I was just like a fish in water, right at home. Like the mic did not feel intimidating. The audience was definitely not intimidating. I know for sure that like the moment I started singing on stage, like I just fell in love with it immediately. And that, I guess there's certain moments in life where you find your calling or you find your purpose or that resonance with the divine occurs. And people sometimes go their whole lives searching for that. And I had like the immense blessing of that happening to me when I was like, before I can remember, when I was 3. The specific context was my mom started her music school in 92. I was two years at the time. We moved to the States when I was a year from Chennai. So she started her music school, and they were putting on, I think, the first like stage performance for her students. It must have been maybe like 8 to 10 of them. My older sister was one of them. And I think had like a competitive spirit that was like, oh, they're doing it, I want to do it too. And I must have known, like these things in like the intuition is one of the most powerful things known to us, right? So I think intuitively I must have known that I had this innate sense for this. My parents put me on stage thinking like, okay, he's pestering us about it, let's just let him sing. But I fell in love with it, and it's been really like truly no looking back ever since then.
Right. You mentioned your mother, Lata Sriram, who of course started her own music school back in the US, right? Sid, growing up after this particular performance, and you might have probably been at home, playing a video game or doing something like that, and then your mother is there taking her Carnatic music classes.
Yeah.
How was that environment? Can you describe that environment for us?
Yeah, it was really like a life source, I think. Growing up away from your mother tongue and away from your roots and such, and I was born here in Chennai. The identity crisis is inevitable. It's going to happen, and it definitely happened. And for me, having this music surrounding me at home, like you can, very right, I didn't play video games growing up. My parents didn't buy me any video games, at least until I was a bit older, so I wasn't good enough at them to keep up with the rest of the guys. But I would be doing other stuff, playing basketball, watching TV, whatever it is, right? But this music was just omnipresent. It was always there. I'd come back home from school, and you'd hear like Sadhu essays, the students singing whatever. And it was really a life source. I think it's what provided me with the sense of being rooted in, I guess saying culture is one thing, but in specifically my relationship to Carnatic music was just like cemented from as far back as I can remember because it was always there. Also, a lot of my early learning wasn't like formal classes, like sitting in front of my mother. It was just taking it in and listening and letting it kind of like osmosis just make its way into my system. And that really, again, shaped the way I've viewed music my whole life, in that I haven't viewed music with a certain sense of rigidity. Mm-hmm. It's always been something that feels like an ocean that's flowing everywhere, and it's something I can tap into as and when I feel like. And I think I owe that definitely to the fact that the music was always around me. Some of my oldest memories of just like socializing, having fun with other kids my age. I had a basketball hoop in the backyard, so a lot of times kids would come to class. Once they finished, they'd come to the back. I'd be playing, we'd play. So many things are tied to this ecosystem of Carnatic music, of the school that my mother had. And also, I think because it was so effortless and so, like I already said, omnipresent everywhere around me, my love for it never felt like a silo. I never felt like, okay, now is the time for music. Now is the time. Music was all the time. It was something that was like water, like air, like anything else. It was an element. And I look back on those times super fondly, like so much joy. And I think that's why even to this day, to me, music is it's a rigorous art form for sure, especially Carnatic music. But the first thing that I associate with it is and will always be joy and celebration.
Sid, because you spoke about your early years learning Carnatic music, I wanted to ask you, who were your... see, I know your grandfather also was a musician. Yes. He was also very, very passionate about Carnatic music, as was your mother. Yeah. Who were your early inspirations or personalities that shaped up your early musical career, and what were some of the most fondest kritis that you sang while you were in your nascent years?
Sure, I like that question. I think it's two-part answer. I think one was the musicians that were like of the yesteryear that I first fell in love with, and that was definitely, I would say my mom's favorite musician of all time is M.S. Subbulakshmi, which is probably true for thousands and hundreds, many people. So those are some of the first recordings I would hear, and I definitely recall just falling in love with that voice. Before I even really could like process it intellectually, I think subconsciously that's something that really inspired me. My grandfather was a big lover of GNB's music, so he put me on to some of those recordings early on. And again, I think the speed with which he was able to deliver sangadis and the brigas and such, that was something that I was drawn to. But the first musician that I fell in love with was Semmangudi Srinivasa Iyer. And I must have been maybe 9 or 10 when someone gifted us a cassette tape of his kacheri. And in that, there's a recording of him singing Navasidhi Petralum, a Neelakanta Shivan song in Kararapriya. And he must have been pretty young in that recording because his voice, as he got older, a certain texture settled in, but it was before that. And it was just insane. That specific recording of the song is like, there's an abandon. The sangadis he's singing are crazy. The way he has emoted Kararapriya is just next level. So I think that was the first song that, like, Carnatic song and recording that I fell in love with, that I would just lay in bed listening to that on repeat. So that's in like the musicians of the yesteryear. Then when I was also growing up was also the time when Sanjay, Subrahmanyam and T.M. Krishna really kind of like burst onto the scene. And for an NRI growing up over there, when they would come to the States for their concerts, I'd go to every single one. And it was so cool to see, at that time, they were youngsters, right? They were just redefining, at least to me, what it meant to be a Carnatic musician. There was a coolness, there was an edginess, always a humility, but they also had this sense of confidence on stage where they commanded the energy of the room. And that was hugely inspirational for me. I think both of them, obviously very different styles of music, but the gravitas that they held on stage. And I think maybe one of the first songs that I learned that I like really loved singing, there's two of them. There's Videja Ladura by Tyagaraja. That's one. And that I learned from my grandfather when I was really young, maybe like 5 or 6 or maybe 7. But there's like the Adiye, there's like that. It goes to the high part in the Anupallavi immediately. Like I love just belting that note out. So that when I got a little bit older, Meenakshi Mevadam, Dikshata Kriti in Purvi Kalyani. That's the first song that it's just such a there's a deepness to it. There's a little bit of a, I don't want to say sorrow, but a bit of pain, tinge of pain in that, and just this deep sense of devotion. And I think that's the first kriti that I learned where I really tapped into that spirit.
Right.
And once I kind of felt that, and that kind of that emotional spectrum was instilled in me through the singing of that kriti, that's something I've searched for like ever since. But there's countless songs. There's so many more.
So, what was your practice routine like in those days? Because I've heard many tales of how Carnatic musicians practice their, rigid routine, which I'm sure some of which might have been instilled in you from your grandfather or your mother, in that sense. So, how was that practice routine like?
Yeah, my grandfather was never the strict one. It was always my mom. He'd let me kind of get away with it. But when I was young, I actually hated sitting down and like practicing. And I like I said before, so much of my initial learning was just like listening and picking it up that way. So when I was quite young, I think my practice, before I'd go to school, I'd sing voice exercise, akaram, for maybe 30 minutes. I'd try to get out of doing that most days, but my parents stayed on me. I'd come back from school, and at first it'd be minimal practice when I'd come back when I was quite young. As I got a little bit older, about like 45 minutes to an hour. But even that, I'll say this, I didn't grow up like the most disciplined. I was definitely like, not the problem child, but the one that was the hardest to like keep down. You know, I was trying to run around all the time. My attention span was not, super set. My mind was always racing. But I think within that, so the rigidity of the practice, the rigor was something that was really like pushed on me, and I'm very grateful for it, because as I got older, the structure that was really kind of, that my parents were strict about, it started making more sense, and I kind of fell in love with that. But when I was young, it was very haphazard in terms of practice, learning songs here and there, singing when I felt like it. Again, my parents making sure that I sat and practiced for a minimal, like at least 30 to 40 minutes every day. And then I think when I went to college, that's when it really changed, because at that point, my relationship to Carnatic music was less about like just practicing, or less about the discipline of it, and it really became my mechanism to stay connected with home. Because for the first time I was away from home. I went to college in Boston, which was across the country from where I grew up. So staying connected to home in terms of like where I grew up, but also, when you're in college and you're in a new environment surrounded by just a whole new universe for the first time, that's also, I would say, the first time where you really feel the need to deeply understand oneself and start asking the questions of like, who am I? What are my ideals? What makes me who I am? And then if you're also simultaneously on an artistic pursuit, you start to ask the questions like, what is my music? Why do I do what I do? What is beyond this chase for fame or whatever? What is the value in what I'm doing for myself? And Carnatic music practice and the rigor of that quickly became a portal through which I could start kind of undoing some of these knots within myself. So then that was a really profound set of realizations, because I think for the first time when I was in college and practicing Carnatic music in this way, I just started to understand why I love what I do. It brought me back to the moments of when I was younger. When I was younger, even though I would like give a little bit of trouble to practice, I would still have these moments when I would practice of just like transcendence. Points in time where I'd feel something buzzing throughout my body, and you feel like you're levitating almost. Those moments would happen. So those moments were always like points on a map being like, keep going forward. There's something deeply special about this. So when I started getting more into the discipline of practice in college, I was able to start reconnecting to those points in time and kind of drawing the map out a bit more and understanding it, and really, I think for the first time, forming my own artistic and musical perspective.
Right, just as an extension of what you just said, Sid, how difficult was it for you? You were born right here in Chennai.
Yeah.
Of course, you shifted to the US quite young.
Yeah.
Talk to me about identity crisis, right? So you are a Tamilian, an Indian, growing up in the US.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm pretty sure you are friends with the Indian diaspora there.
Yeah.
Especially because your mother was a Carnatic music teacher.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure a lot of Indian kids would come to her
Yes.
Carnatic music classes. But how much of an identity crisis did you go through at that point of time? Like things like 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 what you just said, right? Who am I? Like which stream do I belong to? What do I do? I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure you also had American kids as friends growing up. So these thoughts, when they come to your mind, how would you untie these kind of knots that were forming in your head?
Yeah, I think it really one identity crisis was very present throughout growing up, but in a way that I didn't logically really understand it. I always just knew that and it happened at multiple levels. One level is obviously having been born here in Chennai, moving to the US, being away from the place I was born in. So on one level, there's that, living in a country that the language is completely different, the cultural cues are different. You don't see anyone that's Indian or looks similar in like popular culture. There's that level of it. The second level was I grew up actually in Fremont, California, where there's a lot of Indian people within the music school that my mom ran, and outside of that as well. My school was maybe at the time, let's say like 60 to 70% Indian, or like just a lot. So I was surrounded by people who looked like me. But the identity crisis there was I was always passionate about music, and that's the thing that was always running in my head. Whereas there weren't many people around me who held the same passion. It was a very academically rigorous and driven kind of school system as well, which I did not relate to at all, because I knew that there was something else in me that I had to pursue and had to, like, a calling that I had, right? So that was another like major sense of identity crisis as well. And I think the untying of the knots only started happening when I was in college. Up until, and even through college, it still was present. In that I guess I didn't really know who I was. I knew that I had a gift. I knew that I felt very rooted in, like, I was very sure of where I came from and what my roots were. But on the day-to-day, everything from like how you dress, how you speak, they call it code switching. But, in what context do I speak in which way, those confusions. So on a very micro kind of level, this stuff just kind of existed through everyday life. I'm very grateful that I had music, because music at that point was more of an escape from having to think about this stuff, from having to kind of like process a lot of this. And I think only through college, only once I was away from home, only once I really, really, truly dove into my musical pursuit of writing my own music, of starting to experiment with kind of creating my own sound, and also like understanding myself, being the beginnings of being an adult, at that point is when I think the untying of some of those knots started happening. But through college, all that was still there. It was very present. You don't really know. Simply put, I just wasn't sure who I was. I would have flashes and transient moments of feeling a sense of belonging within self. But more often than not, I was very confused. And that manifests in various ways. That manifests in, you kind of wear different hats and different masks until the point where you're like, oh, now I know. And that knowing of self only happened once I semi-moved to Chennai in 2016, post Tiruppugazh. Just like fast forwarding a bunch. But once that song came out and, it really blew up, I started spending about 8 months out of the year here in Chennai. And for the first time, I was here not in the context of my parents, not in the context of relatives. I wasn't an NRI coming back here to look at this city through their lens, but I was really forming my own relationships, my own ecosystem, my own rootedness to this place. Once that happened is when, up until then, so much of my life felt like the series of just like smoke screens and masks and such. And not to say I was ever fake, but I hadn't yet gotten to the core of who I was. And then through the time that I spent in Chennai, as my career really like skyrocketed at that point, I developed a kind of quiet sense of confidence and a knowing of like just knowing self. And I think from that point, it's just been, continuing to understand the different dimensions of who I am, embracing all aspects of it, and feeling very comfortable in whatever room I go into. That code switching stuff doesn't really apply anymore. I feel like, it stopped applying around that time, and I've been able to kind of really lock into a groove I feel like, since then.
Very nice. Very
Yeah.
nice. கனக சபை மேவும் எனது குருநாதா கருணை முருகேச பெருமாள்கான். Sid, I'm going to be fast forwarding many years, okay, to 2024 when you performed at Coachella, right?
Yes.
You performed Tiruppugazh at a venue which was filled with people. A lot of people who were there might have been very alien to Carnatic music, and you sort of introduced a new brand of music to them during that particular phase that you performed Tiruppugazh in.
Yeah.
For me, it was the closest parallel I can draw is when A.R. Rahman won his Oscars, and he said Ella Pugarum Irevanike in Tamil at the global stage. I think that's the kind of parallel that I see, because you were also the first South Indian artist to perform at this particular festival.
Yeah.
Tell me about what went into this particular decision of performing this particular number at such a stage, one, and two, what does this whole thing signify to you?
Sure. I think about a year before that, I'd done a show in LA at this venue called the Roxy, which is like a legendary LA venue. And it was right before I'd put out my English album. And at the end of that show, and a lot of the people who had come to that show were young Indian or South Asian kids from the area. So at the end of that set, when I'd finished the last song and the encore and everything, it just kind of hit me, let me sing this piece, just a cappella, no instruments, no nothing. I spoke to the audience, spoke about my kind of experience growing up in the States, a lot of what we actually just talked about. And I also spoke on the importance of staying just true to self and wearing your badge of who you are proudly without any apology. And kind of automatically, after saying all those things, it just flowed that this song happened. And from that point, every show after that, I would sing this song at the end of my sets. And these sets were primarily, even if it's to Indian audiences, mostly to English-speaking Indian kids or NRIs. Or we went on tour the following month with this huge alternative indie band from the US, Bon Iver, who I've been a fan of for a long time. And those were cities where there was absolutely no Indian people in the audience. And I'd still end with this piece. First, it was it was an intuitive decision. It wasn't something that I really thought about and strategized and such. And that first moment when I did it just felt right, and I did it. And it was a really kind of powerful moment for me. And sharing in that with a room full of people just amplified the kind of like power and energy of the moment. And after that first point, as I continued to do it show after show, it just, one, became a signature. Two, it really, for me, I've said this many times before, but I really feel like I am an ambassador for the music that I come from, which is, one, being Tamil, two, Carnatic music, and everything else that makes me who I am. And leaving people with this kind of thought of Shivanarmanam Kulira at the end of a set just always felt like I was leaving them with a seed that maybe might germinate and grow with these folks in whatever way. If they already had the context of the kind of composition or who Muruga is and significance of that, then great. If it's a subconscious kind of seed that's planted and, it just shifts the way they listen to music or what they believe music can do, also great. So that's how it kind of just continued to build into 2024 when we were on tour first throughout the month of March. And again, every city we would go to, I would finish with this. And it just always felt like you're ending with a prayer, because literally it is a very spiritually charged song. And two, a quiet would just settle across the room. And our shows really range in dynamic levels. Sometimes we're super loud, super chaotic. Other times quite intimate. But this last piece would always be just my voice, and my sound engineer would take off all the reverb from my vocals, so it's just dry. So there's nothing to hide behind, And every time a complete hush would settle across the whole room, and we just all be in that moment together, hyper present. And I wanted to bring that energy to Coachella. I think going into the 2 weekends of Coachella, I knew the significance culturally of the fact that, one, I was the first South Indian artist. The first weekend, actually, I didn't know that. That was made known to me after I was done. But I knew what I was wearing on my back, and I knew what the opportunity was. Not for personal glory necessarily, but for how I could take the culture that has so powerfully made me who I am, and have it cut through to people who may have never experienced that before. The first weekend, admittedly, was just like one chaotic blur because you're in this major festival. There's so many pushes and pulls of energy, so many like variables before you go on stage, so on and so forth. But the second week, I knew what to expect. So we went super prepared, super focused. And that whole set, I started off with Vakratindra Mahakaya, so the Ganesha slokam. And that already sets the kind of tone. Go through the whole set, and when I finished with Shivanarmanam Kulira on that one clip that went viral, we played before this artist Chapel Roan, who's a mega pop star in the US now. At the time, she was just about to blow up. But a lot of the audience that was there in that space was there for her. And they definitely have zero idea what Carnatic music is. Probably don't know what Tamar is either. Maybe they've heard of it, but not really. So I didn't know it in the moment. It felt very special when I was singing it, and it felt very magnetic. When I went back and look at the footage, and you just see again that same quiet just kind of like fall through the whole audience, and they're just taking it in. Yeah, it gave me chills, because I think you can talk about being an ambassador. You can talk about like, this is what I want to represent, and this is how I want to. I want to be someone who really makes a significant impact on the world by taking who I am and taking that across the world. And then you see it actually happen, and that's a whole other feeling, because there's a sense of not validation, but a sense of like an exhale, because you're like, oh, okay, I'm doing the thing that I set out to do, which is a great feeling. Because up until then, you kind of somewhat feel, you don't feel like a fake, but you feel like until you make good on that promise, one, to yourself and to the people you represent, it's just talk. And then when you do it, okay, it's actionable. You actually, so it felt very special. It did feel profound. And the most beautiful thing was I received just a bunch of messages and comments across the board from fellow Indians who are proud, from non-Indians who are curious, people who are inspired, and people who have taken that moment and taken it as an opportunity to dive into various forms of Indian music since then, just to explore. So really it being a trigger point, and I think I just look forward to having many more such points of inflection or magical moments in my career, because at those points it's more than just me as an individual, but it becomes a much larger kind of conversation, which is great.
Because you mentioned the Tiruppugazh, I was just curious, Sid, what was your initiation into Tiruppugazh, and what does this text and learning those songs mean to you?
Sure. So my mother started learning Tiruppugazh when she was around, like, I want to say like maybe 16, 17, like that age. And she grew up in Mandavelli, and she would go to a class where it was mostly, what I recall her telling me is like mostly older women, maybe like 50s and above and such. And she was the one like youngster, but she always had this affinity, which is always a very inspiring story to me, because I just envision this one like young girl amidst much older women who probably embraced her very warmly, and were very happy to have her there. But that was her initiation to Tiruppugazh. Specifically, the Tiruppugazh that we sing is based off of Guruji Sri A.S. Raghavan's tuning. So Tiruppugazh is an anthology of poems by Saint poet Arunagiri Nadar. But it's just poetry, and just the text in the specific rhythm of each one, which is very special and specific to his structuring of his poems. Then Sri Delhi A.S. Raghavan tuned these, and they've been tuned by different people, but his versions are what my mom learned. And one of the first ones that I learned was Unadu Tiruvadi. When I think that might have been the first song that I sang when I was 3. It might have been that piece that we talked about before. So the first song I ever sang was a Tiruppugazh. And then soon thereafter, and my mom would teach her students Tiruppugazh. She'd have like a set of people who would come every Saturday morning, I believe, to only learn Tiruppugazh from her. And Shivanarmanam Kulira was one of the first ones that I heard, and it just became like this earworm that it would always just be playing in my head. It's in Jonpuri Ragam, one Ragam I already really love, but that specific melody just did something to me. And it was one of the first pieces where I just remember this feeling of a song going into my heart and just like doing something. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And maybe when I was around 9 or 10, I asked her to teach it to me because I was going to be singing a concert in a few days, maybe a little bit older. And I learned it, and I'm pretty sure I didn't get the pronunciation like super perfect because at the time, some of my Carnatic singing would still have a little bit of like an anglicized accent to it. But that piece at the end of the concert got a lot of, like, people asked me about it afterwards. From that point, I just kind of fell in love with more Tiruppugazh, and she started teaching me more. And it's just been this beautiful relationship with it. My relationship to my spirituality and to Hinduism and to Muruga specifically has always been a very intuitive relationship. I haven't done all that much to try to uncover it and understand it as such. But I do believe that Tiruppugazh and learning these pieces gave me the opportunity to subconsciously and intuitively connect to my spiritual relationship. Because I didn't have to think about it other than obviously learning the piece. But I was able to feel this sense of connection and resonance to the divine through song, you know. And I think a lot of, and I immediately felt this deep affinity to Muruga from a young age. Soon thereafter, I started reading Kandashashti Kavacham every day, and so on and so forth. So Tiruppugazh has been a real, it sounds weird calling it a tool. It's much bigger, but it's just this beautiful mechanism for me to connect with my relationship to God, for sure.
Right. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the December music season, Sid. I know you make it a point to come to Chennai in most of the Decembers and perform at the December music season. In fact, after your growth as a film artist, your popularity as a film music artist, I know a lot of people who might not have gone to kacheris ever earlier. They come to Carnatic kacheris because they want to listen to you and they want to, you know, discover this new art form which they probably might not have been exposed to in their earlier years.
Sure.
What does the music season signify to Sid Sriram, and where does he see this particular concept going in the future?
So most of my life I've been performing during the Margazhi Masam here. Again, the beauty and the power of it is the fact that there's so much Carnatic music happening across 1 month. You see audiences from around the world that come, a lot of people. That's also a time where in the US they don't have school, so you see a lot of NRIs coming here at that time. I love it for the energy. Like, you know, there's certain intangibles, just like palpable energy in a space during that time, because people are so looking forward to listening to Carnatic music. And I for me, it's been a real blessing since my film career really took off, like you said, to see audiences across backgrounds, across age groups come, because I believe that Carnatic music is a very, very dynamic, accessible form of music. I think there is sometimes the thought that it's like highly technical, which it is, and also highly complex, which it is. But I think the beauty in Carnatic music is within these parameters of complexity, technicality, there is an innate sense of connection in Carnatic music. And it's not necessarily only a spiritual connection. I think that is one of the cornerstones for sure. But if you look at it purely just as a music form, the way that songs are presented in, like, you have different tempos, for example, you have different languages. But the biggest thing for me is the way that you can really build, the same way in a film, you build an arc, start, middle, finish, a climax point, different points of just like energetic momentum shifts and such. You know, everything that really goes into an artistic experience where you can really hold the audience's hand and bring you along. A Carnatic concert and kind of like what makes Carnatic music what it is allows for that. And it's been really cool for me to see these packed auditoriums of both connoisseurs and newcomers really lock in with what I'm doing. But I think it's really special that we have this month-long festival in one place. And I don't know if there's anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. So it's definitely something I'm very proud of.
Said you spoke about the December music season. I just wanted to know your thoughts about the role of Indian classical music in today's times. You know, just a few years ago, I had asked you to, you know, write a piece for The Hindu about the role of Carnatic music. And you wrote then, and I'm just going to read what you wrote to you, which is, I believe, exploration, not perfection, is the highest goal of all artistic pursuit. This rings especially true with a form such as Carnatic music, where improvisation is at its very core. What exactly is this exploration that you refer to, and how much of this exploration is happening with you and other classical artists today?
First, I'm glad you read that. I wrote a good piece. That sounds nice. I think I mean I believe in that now more than ever. Probably even more than I believed in it then. But I think exploration specifically in the context of Carnatic music, you know, so much of a Carnatic concert, whether you're singing Alapane, Kalpana Swaram, or even how you decide to embellish a song here and there, Neraval Tanam, across the board, percussive improvisation, the conversation between the different musicians on stage, it's all really held up on the bedrock of spontaneity and improvisation. And when you're really improvising, when you have the tools and you've developed the skill set to be able to be on stage and not prepare what you're going to improvise, but really let it come, they call it manodharma, but come from within you and put forth new ideas in real time. To me, there's nothing more inspiring artistically than that. Can't think about anything, you know, and what I think at the core of like meditation or so many spiritual practices is not dwelling on the past, not thinking about the future, but just being here in this moment because it's the only thing that really exists. And exploration through music, through improvisation, I think is one of the most beautiful examples of that, of being hyper present. I think life is most beautiful when you're like really, and it's a cliche, but really in the moment. And getting to do that exploration in real time, for me, has been a practice in that, being present. And I think that's why it's so important. I think that's also what gives birth to new ideas. I am sometimes afraid that this pursuit of perfection, which I've also spoken about in that same quote, completely kills the pursuit of exploration. Because perfection to me, you're going to try to like sanitize something to the point where it's like everything is exactly how it's supposed to be. And what do you lose in that process? You lose a potential super raw moment that could have been revolutionary because you want to make sure that it's presented pristine. And I'll end this answer with the to each their own. If someone believes that that is the height of a pursuit, then, and there's probably some great profound beauty in that as well. For me, what I realized, the kind of musician I am, the kind of human being I am, I'm after the raw moments. So, like, my favorite musician currently is Flute Mali, who's also like a distant relative of ours. Not that distant. But there's one recording of his that I listen to all the time. It's actually before my Coachella performance. That's what I was listening to on repeat, like when we were driving out to the venue now. He does, I think, Nado Pasana and Bekada Ragam. But he does like a pretty involved Alapane that kind of morphs into Tanam, then back into Alapane. And you can tell that this was a musician that could see sound like three-dimensionally. The way he chooses to have silence, randomly just have this quick spurt of a Sangadi, then go into something that almost sounds like it's inspired by like Western classical music, then go right back into a very Carnatic Sangadi in a ragam like Begada that is like, you know, one of the heavy ones where you can't cheat your way through it by just going up and down a scale, you know. I feel like he, to me, at least where I'm at right now, is the pinnacle of just boundless, fearless exploration where he did not care about what anyone thought. He had something to say, he said it. Definitely wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking, if anything. Like you see quite a bit of people who are not necessarily born and raised in Chennai, like myself, really like pushing the boundary of Carnatic music here and abroad. 25, 30 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? You were seeing the seeds, like, again, talking about artists like Sudha Raghunathan, Sanjay, Subrahmanyam, Krishna, Sairam, so on. There were inspirations for many of us living abroad to be like, oh, could be something that I really pursue. So the seeds were sown then. And I think maybe now my hope and belief is that myself, like, we are those people now to like inspire the next generation of youngsters. Like, oh, this is something that I can do. How it'll be different in 25 years from now, I can't say. I can't really tell. I think my hope is that it becomes my belief is that Carnatic music is a form that should like spread across the world, that everyone should know about. Obviously, it needn't be forced on anyone, but I think it has the potential to really catch like wildfire across the whole world. And that is what I think my responsibility is, or that's what I've taken on as my responsibility as an ambassador for the form. So my hope for the future is that we just see practitioners from even more varied backgrounds, parts of the world, even within India, people who maybe had not thought about going into Carnatic music before, being passionate about it. And I think that might be what happens in the future. We just might see an even more diverse output, both in terms of performers and audiences.
Looking forward to that.
Radha Sameda Krishna, Krishna Radha Sameda Krishna, Krishna Radha Sameda Krishna, Sameda Krishna, Sameda Krishna, Radha Sameda Krishna. Nanda Kumara Navanita Chora, Nanda Kumara Navanita Chora, Brindavana Govinda Murare, Brindavana Govinda Murare, Radha Sameda Krishna, Sameda Krishna, Sameda Krishna, Radha Sameda Krishna. చూపే బంగారమాయనే శ్రీవల్లి మాటే మాణిక్యమాయనే.
I wanted to ask your thoughts about one particular song. We spoke about a lot of songs, Sid, but this particular song, Nee Singam Dan, which happens to be everyone's favorite. It is Virat Kohli's favorite. You know that, right? And how was recording that particular song?
Really special piece. From the word go, it's one of those songs, the first note is just like this royal kind of, there's just a real presence to it. So as soon as I heard the rough, I knew it was special, and I poured everything into that one. I was like, that line to me is like, encapsulates what that is, because this